Aachen, October 1944. A row of apartment blocks on the eastern edge of the old city. A German rifleman of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division is set up at a shattered window on an upper floor, and everything about his position is correct. His machine gun is sighted to sweep the length of the street below. His field of fire runs clean from one intersection to the next, along the paving stones and the tram lines and the rubble that the bombing has already piled against the buildings. He has grenades stacked within reach. He has a clear line back through the apartment to a stairwell, and from that stairwell down into a cellar that connects, through a hole knocked in the party wall, to the cellar of the house beside it, and to the one beside that. He can fight here, fall back there, and appear somewhere the Americans do not expect. This is exactly what he was trained to do. This is exactly what the city was built to let him do. He is waiting for the Americans to come down the street. That is the entire logic of his position. In a city, the attacker must eventually move, and to move he must use the streets, and when he uses the streets, he steps into the open, where the machine guns are waiting. Everyone on the German side understood this. It was the first principle of the whole defense. The street was the battlefield. The street was where the attacker died. And then the wall behind him explodes. Not the window in front of him, where his gun is pointed. The wall at his back, the interior wall that separated his room from the next apartment. The wall that faced no street at all, and therefore faced nothing dangerous. It comes apart in a spray of brick and plaster and choking dust, and through the gap, before the dust has even settled, come American infantrymen who did not walk down his street, who were never on his street, who had spent the last hours moving sideways through the insides of the buildings themselves, from cellar to cellar and room to room, punching through one wall after another, and never once stepping into the field of fire he had so carefully prepared. He never fired the machine gun. There was nothing to fire it at. The enemy did not come from the direction the enemy was supposed to come from. Across the German positions in Aachen that October, in prisoner statements and unit reports, and the recollections of men who lived through it, the same bewildered observation surfaces again and again in different words. The Americans would not come down the street, they came through the walls. That is a strange thing for a defender to complain about. He is not saying the Americans were braver in the street, or that they won the fight for the street. He is saying they refused to have the fight at all. They looked at the street that was the whole point of the defense, the street that every gun and every grenade and every sight line had been arranged around, and they simply declined to use it. And a defense built entirely around punishing an enemy in the street has no answer to an enemy who is never in the street. So here is the question this whole account exists to answer. Aachen was, on paper, close to an ideal place to defend. It was a dense old European city of stone and masonry, a maze of narrow streets and heavy buildings, sitting in a bowl ringed by high ground, wired into the strongest fixed fortifications Germany possessed. It was defended by men who had been ordered by Hitler himself to hold it to the last, in the first great city of the Reich, to stand in the path of the Western Allies, and the men attacking it were desperately few. The Americans who actually assaulted the city center numbered fewer than 1,100 combat infantrymen, against a garrison of roughly 5,000. By every measure that urban warfare is supposed to reward, the defender should have made the attacker bleed for weeks, for every block, for every house. It is worth remembering that neither side particularly wanted to fight here at all. The American First Army, under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, had originally hoped to slide past Aachen to the south, punch through the fortified belt, and drive on toward the industrial heart of Germany beyond, leaving the old city to wither behind the advance. Aachen sat wired into the Siegfried Line, the great pre-war belt of German border fortifications, with one thinner line of works running to the west of the city and a stronger line to the east, so that the city sat in a fortified pocket between them. As the American drive slowed against those defenses and against stiffening German resistance, bypassing gave way to encircling, and encircling meant a battle. The 7th Corps, under Major General Lawton Collins, would take the ground south of the city, and the 19th Corps the ground to the north. A place of little real military value became the site of a bitter fight, precisely because both sides had now decided, for reasons that had more to do with politics and symbolism than with terrain that it could not simply be walked around. The defenders did fight hard. They did inflict serious losses, and they were still taken apart in a matter of days, many of them killed or captured in positions they considered impregnable, by an enemy that in case after case they never managed to bring under the fire they had prepared. The answer to why has almost nothing to do with American courage, though there was plenty of it, and almost nothing to do with numbers, which favored the defender inside the city. It has to do with a question the American army had learned to ask in the hedgerows of Normandy and the ruins of a French port months earlier. Not who controls the street, a different question entirely. What if you never use the street at all? Before we get to how the Americans dismantled the defense itself deserves to be taken seriously, because it is the easiest part of this story to wave away, and waving it away makes the outcome look inevitable when it was not. German urban defensive doctrine in 1944 was not primitive, and it was not improvised. It was the distilled product of the hardest schooling any army had received in the entire war. The Germans had learned to fight in cities at Stalingrad, in the winter of 1942 to 1943, in a battle so pitiless that their own soldiers coined a word for it: Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, a struggle fought not for cities but for individual buildings, individual floors, individual rooms, where the front line ran through the middle of a factory and a staircase could change hands a dozen times. Out of that horror, the Germans took a set of hard principles about how a city should be held. A city multiplies the strength of the defender and cripples the attacker. Buildings become fortresses, cellars become bunkers and covered highways. The rubble that bombing and shelling create does not clear the ground for the attacker. It blocks it, channels it, and funnels the attacker into predictable lanes that the defender has already ranged. Narrow streets neutralize the attacker's advantage in tanks, because armor in a street is blind and boxed in and vulnerable to a man with a shaped charge at close range, and the defender fights from concealment, never showing himself, choosing when and where to open fire, then slipping away through the interior before the return fire arrives. At Aachen, the terrain made all of this even stronger. The old city was built of thick masonry that shrugged off small arms fire and much of the artillery. The streets were a tangle. The ground rose to a ring of hills on the northern and western sides, crowned by the Lösberg, which the Americans called Observatory Hill, and below it, the Salvatorberg with its church, and Farwick Park with the grand Quellenhof Hotel that would become the German command post and one of the last strongpoints to fall. Beneath the streets ran a sewer system that the defenders used exactly as doctrine prescribed, as a hidden road network to move squads unseen and to surface behind an enemy who thought a block was already cleared. And there was one refinement that mattered more than any other, because it goes to the very heart of what the German soldier at that upper window believed about his own survival. The German mortar crews and machine gunners at Aachen were, by numerous accounts, not especially interested in firing at targets they could actually see. According to more than one account of the fighting, they set their mortars on the upper floors of buildings, firing up out of the windows so that neither the weapon nor its crew could be spotted from the street below. And they did not wait to see an American to shoot at. They pre-registered their fire on the streets themselves, on the intersections, the open stretches, the obvious lanes of advance, the places they knew the Americans would have to cross. Then, they simply dropped shells onto those places, whether or not anyone happened to be standing in them at that instant, on the correct assumption that sooner or later an American would be. The street was pre-killed. It did not matter whether they could see you. If you were in the street was already zeroed, and the shells were already on the way. Sit with what that means, because it is the German theory of the battle expressed as a physical fact. The defender did not need to find the attacker, he needed only to make the street lethal and wait for the attacker to enter it, because the attacker always entered it. That was the iron assumption underneath everything. In a city, to advance is to use the street, and to use the street is to die. The German soldier in Aachen was not merely brave or stubborn, though he was often both. He was operating inside a theory of urban war that had been paid for in the blood of Stalingrad, and that had proven correct over and over again. Within that theory, his position was close to perfect. He was concealed, he was covered, he had escape routes, and the killing ground in front of him was already sealed by fire. He did not even have to aim. None of this was a bluff, and the symbolic stakes made the German resolve harder still. Aachen was not just any city. It had been the seat of Charlemagne, the place where he held his court and where he was buried, the coronation city of German kings for 600 years. Nazi propaganda claimed Charlemagne's empire as the First Reich, which made Aachen a kind of ancestral capital, and made its loss unthinkable. Hitler declared it a fortress to be defended to the last man and the last bullet. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt ordered the commandant to hold the venerable city to the last man, and, if it came to it, to let himself be buried under its ruins. The pressure to make Aachen a graveyard for the attacker came from the very top of the German state. How seriously the Germans took that pressure can be measured by what happened to the one general who tried to spare the city. In the middle of September, before the main battle, the defense of Aachen fell to the badly weakened 116th Panzer Division under Lieutenant General Gerhard von Schwerin. Looking at the situation, von Schwerin decided the city could not be meaningfully held and should not be senselessly destroyed, and he left a letter for the incoming American commander, meaning to spare the place a pointless fight. Before it could serve that purpose, the situation shifted. The letter fell into German hands instead, and von Schwerin was relieved of command and briefly arrested for it. In the end, protected by senior officers who valued him, he escaped serious punishment and was later given another command in Italy. But the lesson to every officer who came after him at Aachen was unmistakable. There would be no more talk of surrender. Aachen would be held, and it would be made to cost. If this kind of history holds your attention, the forgotten mechanics of how battles were actually won and lost on the ground, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this sort of detailed account reach more people who care about getting it right. Before the Americans could fight for the inside of Aachen, they had to close a ring around it, and that fight was its own brutal preface to the city battle. The plan was a pincer. The 30th Infantry Division would push down from the north, and the First Infantry Division would push up from the south, and the two arms would meet behind the city and seal it off. Neither pincer had an easy time of it. The 30th Division had already forced a crossing of the Würm River at the beginning of the month, and clawed its way through a section of the Siegfried Line, through concrete pillboxes that had to be taken one at a time, before it could even begin to turn toward the meeting point near the town of Würselen. On the southern arm, the 1st Infantry Division ground uphill through fortified villages and the high ground that guarded the approaches. One position on that shoulder shows what the fighting cost. At a rise the Americans called Crucifix Hill, a company of the 18th Infantry went at a cluster of pillboxes in daylight on the 8th of October. Its commander, Captain Bobby Brown, crawled forward under fire and destroyed bunker after bunker by hand, shoving explosive pole charges against the firing slits, wounded more than once in the process. He would receive the Medal of Honor for it. That was the price of a single hill on the ring, and there were many hills. The gap that would not close was at Würselen, in the north, where the ground between the two American arms stayed open far longer than the plan allowed. The pressure on the commanders was intense. Hodges leaned hard on the 30th Division, to the point of threatening to relieve its general if the link was not made. Finally, on the 16th of October, a flanking push by the men of the 119th Infantry met a patrol of the 18th Infantry coming up from the south near the high ground of the Ravensberg. In the late afternoon, the two forces joined hands, and the ring around Aachen was shut. The Germans understood exactly what that meant and threw everything they could reach at the seam to break it open again, feeding division after division into piecemeal counterattacks from outside. By the official reckoning, the equivalent of 20 battalions was hurled against the 30th Division alone. They came in a few at a time rather than in one concentrated blow, and they were broken against American artillery and air power, and the ring held. With the city sealed, the Americans offered the garrison a way out before the assault began. On the 10th of October, they sent an ultimatum under a white flag, carried into the German lines by an American officer and his escort. "Surrender the city within a day," it said, "or it would be destroyed by air and by artillery." The man who held military command in the city at that moment was a colonel named Reich, standing in before the garrison's permanent commandant arrived, and in accordance with Hitler's fortress order, he rejected it. What followed was a demonstration of what refusal would mean. Formations of American fighter bombers came over the city and struck their targets, and the massed guns of the Corps and the division fired thousands of rounds into it over the following days. Then the infantry of the 26th Regiment climbed over a high railway embankment on the southeastern edge of the city and started in. So the stage is set for exactly the battle the Germans wanted. And for a moment, in the opening days, they got it. As the American assault into the city proper developed, the defenders showed at once that the theory still had teeth. The first infantry to push into the city were ambushed. Men were hit by fire from positions they could not locate, from cellars and upper windows and rubble piles, from riflemen who fired once and vanished before anyone could fix them. Germans surfaced from the sewers behind the leading American squads and shot them in the back, then dropped back underground. The pre-registered mortar fire came down on the streets exactly as designed, punishing anyone who tried to move along the obvious routes. Snipers worked from the upper floors, invisible below the windowsills. The German command threw in what reserves it had, and they hit hard. A battalion of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, veteran troops far tougher than the converted sailors and airmen and policemen who filled out much of the garrison, was fed into the city in the middle of the battle. It counterattacked around Reich Park and the high ground, retook ground the Americans had taken, and at one point pushed German tanks to within a couple of hundred yards of an American battalion command post. Outside the city, German divisions counterattacked again and again to try to break the encirclement open before it closed, and the fighting to shut the ring cost the Americans thousands of casualties on the approaches before the assault on the center had even properly begun. The two American infantry divisions engaged around Aachen absorbed heavy losses in the encirclement fighting. This was not a walkover. The defenders were doing real damage, and doing it in the way their doctrine promised they would. The particular strongpoints tell the story better than any summary can. When Corley's 3rd Battalion first pushed into the industrial ground on the northeastern edge of the city, it ran into a foundry whose walls had been reinforced with sheets of tank armor plate, a building that simply shrugged off tank fire and had to be broken open and cleared at close quarters. When the fighting reached Reich Park and the Quellenhof Hotel, the grand building that had served as the German headquarters before the commandant moved on, the defense there was handed to that battalion of veteran SS men. They turned the hotel's billiard room and its beauty parlor and its dining rooms into firing positions. When the Americans came at the park in the middle of the month, the SS battalion counterattacked hard, retook the neighboring bathhouse building called the Kurhaus, and for a time drove German tanks to within a couple of hundred yards of Corley's own command post. Outside the ring, meanwhile, the German Corps commander, General Friedrich Köchling, kept trying to punch a relief corridor through to the city with a Panzer Grenadier Division and the reconstituted armor of the Greyhound Division, and only when those attacks had bled themselves white did the higher command pull the surviving SS Panzer units back and leave the garrison to its fate. The men holding Aachen were not going quietly, and where the fighting stayed close and confined and street-bound, they held. Here is the crucial thing to understand about that damage, and it is the pivot on which this whole account turns. The Germans were winning the battle they had prepared to fight. Every one of those early successes came from a single piece of logic. The ambush, the sniper, the pre-registered mortar fire, the tank waiting at close range, the men rising out of the sewers behind a cleared block. All of it worked for one reason, and one reason only. The attacker was in the street. The entire German defense was a machine for killing an enemy who moved through the streets, and in the opening days, that machine ran exactly as intended, because that is how city fighting had always gone. And this is where the reversal lives. The same reversal that runs underneath so many of these stories. The obvious explanation for what happened next would be that the Americans were simply better street fighters, that they cleared the houses more aggressively, that they won the close quarters battle for the city block. They did not. They were not more numerous inside the city. They were, in the assault, badly outnumbered. They did not outbrawl the German garrison house by house on the German terms. What they did was refuse the German terms altogether. The Germans had built a perfect defense of the street. The Americans looked at that defense and decided not to contest the street. It was not that they were better at the game, it was that they had stopped playing it. To understand where that idea came from, we have to leave Aachen for a moment and go back a few months and a few hundred miles, because the instinct that broke the city was not written in any grand pre-war doctrine. It was learned the hard way, in mud and hedges and rubble, by the same army now standing at the gates of the Reich. It is tempting to imagine that the United States Army arrived at Aachen with a polished manual for city fighting, a secret method worked out by clever officers years in advance. The truth is less tidy and more interesting. The Army's first real field manual, dedicated to attacking fortified positions and fighting in towns, had appeared only in January of 1944, less than a year before Aachen. It drew on limited experience from the Mediterranean and on study of how the Germans and Soviets had fought in the East. It had useful things to say about a deliberate pace, about small unit initiative, about using firepower generously. But on one central point, it was simply wrong. It badly underrated the role of tanks in a city, treating armor as only occasionally useful against the odd strongpoint. The men who would fight at Aachen could not have run the battle out of that manual if they had tried. What they had instead was something the manual could not give them. They had the previous 5 months. They had Normandy, where the American infantry and armor had been mauled in the hedgerow country, the bocage, a maze of ancient earthen banks and sunken lanes where the Germans were nearly invisible, and where a tank without infantry, or infantry without a tank, died quickly. Out of that agony the Americans had learned, at the level of instinct rather than instruction, that tanks and infantry had to fight as one thing, joined at the hip, each covering what the other could not. They had learned to lead with firepower and to spend ammunition freely against ground that might hold an enemy, rather than sending men forward to find out with their bodies. They had learned to comb a suspicious position with fire first and ask questions after. The American army had a name for that habit: reconnaissance by fire. Rather than send a scout forward to discover whether a hedge or a building held an enemy and risk his life to gain the knowledge, the Americans would simply rake the suspect ground with fire and see what happened, treating any position that might be occupied as occupied until proven empty. It was a habit born of an army that had ammunition to spare and a deep reluctance to spend men to buy information that bullets could buy instead. That instinct, carried out of the hedgerows, would matter enormously in a city full of buildings that might or might not hold a defender. And they had learned something specific about heavy guns and hard fortifications at the French port of Brest, which fell in September of 1944 after a brutal siege. At Brest, the Americans had taken one of the strangest heavy weapons in the arsenal, a self-propelled gun built by bolting a large 155mm cannon onto a tank chassis, and had used it not the way artillery was normally used, lobbing shells from far behind the line, but by driving it straight up to a fortification and firing into it point blank. Against concrete that shrugged off everything else, a 155mm shell, fired from a few hundred yards away, could simply take the structure apart. The gun crews learned what that weapon could do to a wall when you looked down the barrel at it. They would remember. Add to all of this the particular character of the division that drew the Aachen mission, the First Infantry Division, the big red one of the most experienced formations in the American Army, blooded in North Africa and Sicily and on Omaha Beach. The 2 battalions that would actually clear the city were led by men cut from hard cloth. The 26th Infantry Regiment was commanded by Colonel John Seitz. His 2nd Battalion was led by Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniel, and his 3rd Battalion by Lieutenant Colonel John Corley, both men who had been fighting Germans since the landings in the Mediterranean, both comfortable improvising under fire, both trusted by their superiors to run their own fights. Corley was a West Point officer. Daniel had come to the army by a stranger road, a college teacher and scientist by training who had turned out to have a hard gift for the management of violence. The corps commander thought the division's battalion commanders a remarkable group, and he was right. That trust mattered as much as any weapon, because a city fight cannot be run from a map at headquarters. It is 1,000 small decisions made in 1,000 rooms, and the man who has to make each one is the platoon leader or the squad leader standing in the rubble with the enemy a wall away. The division commander handed the city to Colonel Seitz. Seitz handed his 2 halves of it to Daniel and to Corley. And Daniel and Corley, rather than trying to choreograph every move, pushed the real fighting decisions down to the small combined arms teams and trusted the men running them to solve the building in front of them with the tools they had been given. The higher commanders set the method and supplied the firepower. The men at the bottom applied it, block by block, house by house, on their own judgment. It was a way of fighting that only works if the whole chain, from the general down to the corporal, has been trained to think the same way about the problem, and this division had been fighting together long enough that it did. None of these lessons, Normandy, Brest, the culture of the Big Red One, had been assembled in advance into a doctrine of city fighting. Nobody had sat down before the war and reasoned out the method that would break Aachen. It was pieced together on the spot, block by block, out of hard experience that happened to converge in one place at one time. That is the honest origin, and it matters, because it means the thing that defeated the German defense was not a trick the Germans had failed to anticipate. It was a whole way of thinking about combat that the German theory of the street had no category for. Now let us take that way of thinking apart and see the pieces, one at a time, the way the Americans assembled them inside Aachen. The first piece was the one the German rifleman felt in his back. Mouse-holing. The word describes exactly what it was. Rather than move down a street from one building to the next, exposing themselves at every doorway to the fire waiting in the street, the American infantry moved through the buildings. They would blow a hole through an interior wall, or through a cellar wall, or through a ceiling, using dynamite, using packed demolition charges, using bazooka rounds fired at close range, and they would pass through that hole into the next room, or the next house, or the floor above, and then they would blow the next hole, and the next. A whole platoon could advance the length of a city block, from one end to the other, and never once set foot in the street the Germans had so carefully sealed. The engineers who did the blasting became as important as the riflemen. The building itself became the road. Think about what that does to the German at the window. Every assumption underneath his position depended on the attacker being in the street. His machine gun covered the street. The mortars were ranged on the street. His comrades in the cellars were waiting to surface in the street, and the Americans were not in the street. They were coming through the party wall, through the cellar partition, through the floor, arriving from the one direction his entire fighting position was not designed to face. The concealment that made him invisible from the street made him irrelevant, because the fight was no longer happening in the street. He could hold his window against the street for a week. It changed nothing, because nobody was going to attack him from the street. The second piece answered the buildings that were too strong to mouse-hole through, and it was the weapon the crews had first tried out at Brest. When the American infantry ran into a stone or masonry building so solid that tank shells and tank destroyer rounds just chipped at it, they brought up the self-propelled 155mm gun. In the 3rd Battalion's sector, Lieutenant Colonel Corley called one forward around the middle of October, and its effect was immediate and shocking. Its first shell brought a heavy old building down. The impact was so enormous that, by one American account, the vibrations could be felt at the German commandant's own headquarters some distance across the city. When Colonel Seitz saw what it did, he made sure the other assault battalion got one too. The Americans gave the gun nicknames that tell you how they thought about it. The Door Knocker, King Kong, because that is what it was used for. It did not lob shells from far away. It was driven right up the street, its crew dangerously exposed on top of the vehicle, and it fired straight into the face of a building at a range sometimes under 300 meters. And here the tactic married back to the first piece, mouse-holing, in a way that must have seemed almost unfair to the men on the receiving end. A 155mm shell fired into a block of buildings did not just destroy the one it hit. It could punch clean through several walls at once, tearing a tunnel of holes through the interiors of adjoining houses, and the American infantry would then advance through that tunnel, from building to building, without ever exposing themselves to the street. The gun did the mouse-holing for them, on a colossal scale, and collapsed strongpoints as it went. Against the bunkers and the thickest shelters, the gun was brought right up to point-blank range and made to hammer the concrete directly, shell after shell, until whatever was inside could no longer bear it. The gun itself was an oddity, and knowing what it was makes its use at Aachen stranger still. It had been built by mounting a heavy field gun, a design whose lineage reached back to the First World War, on top of an American tank chassis, an ungainly marriage that left the crew standing exposed on an open deck as they served the piece. It had been intended as a weapon of the corps artillery, a gun for reaching far behind the enemy line. At Aachen, it was doing the exact opposite of what it was designed for. It was rolling up a rubble-choked street in plain view of the buildings around it, its crew naked to any rifleman in an upper window, in order to fire a shell heavy enough to crack several feet of reinforced concrete into a target only a short distance away. A crew willing to accept that exposure could reduce almost anything the city contained. When a shell of that weight struck the upper floors of a tall apartment block, it could bring the top of the building down into the street below. When it struck a bunker, the men sealed inside felt as though the world itself were being beaten apart around them, and often that feeling alone was enough to end their fight. The third piece was the method that tied the weapons together, and it belonged above all to Lieutenant Colonel Daniel, whose 2nd Battalion ground through the center of the city. Daniel gave his approach a blunt slogan: "Knock them all down." If a building stood in the path and might hold an enemy, you did not send men in to find out. You brought fire onto it first. His method ran in phases that reversed the German logic completely. First, isolate the piece of the city you were about to clear, walling it off with artillery and mortar fire so the defenders inside could neither be reinforced nor escape. Second, pin those defenders with direct fire from tanks, from tank destroyers, from the heavy guns and machine guns, hammering the building until the Germans were driven down into the cellars to survive. Third, and only then, send in the infantry with grenades and small arms and flamethrowers to finish the fight at close range, moving through the walls the guns had opened. Daniel's battalion did not race ahead. It moved with a deliberate, grinding thoroughness that treated every single building as a strongpoint until proven otherwise, and cleared them in order so that nothing dangerous was left behind and alive. The battalion halted at nightfall on a defensible line rather than pushing into the dark where the German night belonged. Daniel worked out a careful discipline of fire so that his own weight of shells did not fall on his own men. The light mortars and lighter guns worked the ground closest to the advancing infantry, 100 to 300 yards ahead. The medium guns took the belt beyond that. The heaviest fire and the aircraft were kept farther out still, striking targets deeper in the German rear. The tank guns firing into buildings used shells fitted with a slight delay in the fuse, so that the round punched through the wall first and then detonated inside the room, rather than blowing itself apart harmlessly against the outer masonry. To keep the tanks and the infantry and the artillery from hitting one another in the chaos of a city, the Americans used mass-produced maps with every building and intersection numbered and marked, so a squad leader could call fire onto a precise structure by its number, and everyone would know exactly which pile of masonry he meant. Down at the sharp end, each little assault team was a combination of arms in miniature, often a single tank or tank destroyer paired with a platoon or even a squad. The armor would keep a building under fire while the riflemen closed in. Then it would shift its fire to the next building and the process would repeat. It was less like a charge and more like an industrial process for taking a city apart, one structure at a time. The scale of firepower this consumed tells you everything about the philosophy behind it. The Americans were spending shells and grenades and machine gun ammunition in enormous quantities to avoid spending men. In the center of the city, one battalion's expenditure over the fight ran into thousands of mortar rounds, tens of thousands of machine gun rounds, thousands of hand grenades, and gallons of flamethrower fuel. That was the trade at the core of the whole method. Fire is cheap, and men are not. Make the ground pay instead of the soldiers. Where the German theory asked the attacker to expose men in order to advance, the American theory asked the attacker only to expend ammunition, and the American army had ammunition in a quantity the Germans could not begin to match. That abundance was not an accident, and it was the quiet foundation the whole method stood on. An army cannot choose to knock every building down unless it can afford to knock every building down. The long American supply line reached all the way back to the beaches of Normandy, and getting the shells and grenades and flamethrower fuel forward over washed-out autumn roads was itself a constant struggle. But it was a struggle the Americans were winning, and the Germans, hemmed into a shrinking pocket with no way to resupply and a relief that never arrived, were not. The German soldier could be as brave and as skilled as any man in Aachen, and it would not matter, because he was being asked to win a contest of ammunition against an enemy who could always bring more of it than he could. The trade of fire for men only works if you have the fire to trade, and the side that hides behind the walls always runs out first. The fourth piece closed off the German escape hatch, the thing that had let the defenders reappear behind cleared blocks and shoot the Americans in the back. The Americans learned fast to hunt the sewers and the cellars as carefully as the rooms. They sealed the manholes, dropping grenades down and then weighting the covers with heavy debris so the covers could not be lifted from below. They cleared cellars and blocked the connections between them. They learned to clear a building from the top downward, where they could, driving the defenders down and out, rather than fighting up a defended staircase. And where a shelter was packed with troops who would not come out, the flamethrower and the threat of it did the arguing. Massive air raid bunkers with immensely thick walls, holding hundreds of soldiers and often hundreds or thousands of terrified civilians as well, gave up when it became clear the alternative was fire. One by one, the Americans shut the doors the German defense had relied on, until the defenders could no longer slip away and reappear, until a block that was cleared stayed cleared. None of this should suggest the fight was easy for the men who carried it out. Efficient is not the same as safe, and a method built to save lives still spent them. Clearing a city this way was slow, filthy, terrifying work. It meant crawling through the guts of burning buildings, throwing grenades ahead into rooms you could not see, coming face to face with a defender in the dark of a cellar with no warning, and doing it again in the next house, and the next, hour after hour and day after day. The infantry who did the clearing were often exhausted past the point most men can imagine, moving on nerve and habit. The genius of the method was never that it made the fighting comfortable. It was that it stacked every possible advantage on the side of the American soldier before he ever stepped into a room, so that when the close and horrible work finally came, he came to it with the enemy already pinned, already deafened, already driven into the cellar, already stripped of the street he had counted on. It did not remove the danger. It shifted the odds, relentlessly, in one direction. You can watch the whole method work in the taking of the high ground in the last days of the battle. When the Americans came back at the Quellenhof Hotel on the 18th of October, a platoon led by a young officer named William Ratchford charged into the lobby and cleared the opulent building floor by floor and room by room, driving the last defenders down into the basement, where the fight was finished with grenades and automatic weapons. Above the hotel rose the wooded heights the whole battle had been climbing toward, the Salvatorberg with its church, and above it, the Lousberg that the Americans called Observatory Hill. A rifle company took the Salvatorberg by crawling up the forward slope on their hands and knees beneath their own supporting fire, so that the defenders on the crest could never get a clean shot at men who never stood upright to be shot at. The Lousberg itself, the dominating height over the whole city, was taken by an armored task force pushing in from the north, and when the Americans reached the summit, they found the Germans had slipped away in the darkness, rather than be pinned and pounded on the exposed top of the hill. Even in retreat, the defenders were being denied the standing fight their whole doctrine was built around. Now put the four pieces together and look again at the German at the window, because this is the moment the puzzle from the opening resolves. He is concealed, he is covered, his gun sweeps the street, his mortars have the street pre-killed, his cellars connect to an escape route. Every one of these advantages is real, and every one of them is now worthless, because not one of them touches an enemy who advances through the interiors of the buildings, who reduces the strongest houses with a gun firing point blank, who isolates his block with artillery before a single infantryman appears, and who has sealed the sewer he meant to escape through. He prepared, with great skill, for a fight in the street. The Americans never gave him that fight. They came through the walls. The German confusion recorded from inside Aachen makes sense only against that backdrop. These were not stupid men, and many of them were not even inexperienced. They understood, in the specific way a soldier understands his own survival, what should and should not get a man killed in a city. Their whole training told them that if they held their concealed positions and covered the streets, the attacker would be the one to bleed. When the attacker refused the street, that certainty came apart, and there was nothing in their doctrine to replace it. The recurring note in the German accounts is not cowardice, and it is not incompetence. It is bewilderment. The enemy would not fight where the fight was supposed to happen. By the 19th and 20th of October, the German defense was coming apart everywhere at once. Whole groups of defenders, cut off in isolated pockets, out of food and water and ammunition, began to give themselves up. Others did not, and fought on where they stood, and some took their own lives rather than surrender. The Americans, reinforced now by a fresh battalion, borrowed from another division to stand in for the 26th Regiment's missing 3rd Battalion, were carving the surviving German-held ground into smaller and smaller islands. The men still fighting were being squeezed into a shrinking perimeter around their commander's bunker, and the same method that had consumed the rest of the city was closing in on that last redoubt. The end came at a bunker on the northern edge of the city, and it came in a way that was almost a summary of the entire battle. By the 3rd week of October, the German commandant, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, had pulled his headquarters into a massive 4-story air raid shelter on Rütcherstrasse at the foot of the high ground. He was still sending defiant messages. On the 19th of October, he had issued an order of the day, telling the defenders of Aachen to prepare for their last battle, to fight to the last man, the last shell, the last bullet, in accordance with the orders of the Führer, and denouncing as treason any thought of surrender. It was the fortress order restated one final time. Corley's men reached the bunker. They did not storm it. Corley was not going to throw his exhausted infantry against those walls in a frontal assault, and he did not have to. He brought up the 155mm gun and had it fire into the shelter from very close range, shell after shell slamming into the concrete. The walls held, but the sound and shock inside a sealed bunker under that kind of pounding is difficult to imagine and impossible to endure indefinitely. There was, by that point, no ammunition left to speak of, no water, no food, and no relief coming. Wilk sent out 2 of the American prisoners his men had been holding, under a white flag, carrying his willingness to surrender. There is a line, reported in one American account of the surrender, that captures the whole battle in a single sentence. Wilk is said to have remarked that when the Americans started using 155mm guns as sniper weapons, it was time to give up. Whether or not he said it in exactly those words, it is the perfect epitaph for the German defense, because it names the precise thing that broke it. A 155mm gun is not a sniper weapon. It is a piece of siege artillery. Using it as a sniper weapon, driving it up a street to fire point blank into a single building or a single bunker, was the physical expression of the American refusal to fight the street battle. The defender who has prepared to duel riflemen in the rubble has no answer when the attacker replies with artillery fired over open sights into his front door. On the 21st of October 1944, Wilk surrendered the garrison of Aachen against Hitler's explicit orders. The assistant commander of the First Infantry Division, Brigadier General George Taylor, accepted the surrender formally at 12:05 in the early afternoon. Aachen was the first major German city to fall to the Western Allies, the first city of the Reich taken on German soil. Most of it, something on the order of 85%, lay in ruins. The cost had been heavy on both sides. The Americans suffered thousands of casualties in the wider battle for the city and its approaches, though the 2 battalions that actually cleared the center got through the house-to-house fighting far more cheaply than the German theory of urban defense said they should have, a few dozen killed and a few hundred wounded between them, while the German garrison was destroyed and several thousand of its men marched into captivity. In the trade of fire for men, the men had largely been German. The city that was handed over was barely a city anymore. Before the war, Aachen had held well over 100,000 people. By the time the fighting reached the center, most of them had been evacuated or had fled, and only a small remnant remained, sheltering in the deep bunkers and cellars alongside the soldiers. When those great shelters were finally opened, they disgorged not only surrendering troops, but crowds of exhausted civilians who had waited out the battle underground in the dark. The method that spared American infantry did not spare the buildings. A city reduced by fire is a city knocked down, and Aachen was knocked down. The old capital of Charlemagne, the coronation seat of German kings, was left a landscape of broken masonry and roofless walls, its cathedral a battered husk standing over the ruin. This was the first great German city to fall, and its fall was a grim advertisement of what the rest of the war on German soil was going to look like. Ahead of the Americans, only a short distance to the southeast, lay the dark tangle of the Hürtgen forest, where the same army would soon learn that not every problem could be solved by going through the walls. Step back from the rubble and what happened at Aachen resolves into a collision between two different theories of what a city battle even is, each of them coherent, each of them the honest product of the army that held it, and only one of them matching the conditions on the ground in October of 1944. The German theory treated the city as a collection of positions to be held. The defender's job was to occupy the ground, to turn each building into a fortress and each cellar into a bunker, to conceal himself and choose his moments, and to make the attacker pay for every step by forcing that attacker to expose men in the open streets that the defense controlled. Ground was the currency of the battle, and the street was where ground was won and lost. It was a theory forged in the ruins of Stalingrad, and it was, in its own terms, brilliant. Against an enemy who accepted its premises, it worked, and the early days at Aachen showed that it still had every bit of its old lethality when the attacker came down the street. The American theory treated the city not as ground to be held, but as a volume of space to be reduced. The question was never who held a given street. The question was how quickly you could destroy the enemy strongpoint while spending as little exposure as possible to do it. Firepower was substituted for the human body at every point where the German theory demanded a man step into the open. Where the German asked, "Who controls the street?" the American asked, "How I destroy that building without entering the street at all?" And the answer, worked out in the hedgerows and refined at Brest and executed at Aachen by battalion commanders trusted to run their own fights, was to go through the walls, to bring the siege gun up to the door, to isolate and pin and burn and blast, and to let the buildings themselves be the road. There is a deeper contrast underneath the tactics, in the two armies' whole idea of how a battle should be commanded. German military culture prized the initiative and judgment of the individual leader on the spot, the man in the building making the right call in the moment, and it produced extraordinary small unit fighters, often better man for man than their opponents. The American army increasingly treated the fight as a system, a coordinated machine of infantry and armor and artillery and engineers, in which the decisive genius lay less in any single heroic decision and more in how well the pieces were made to work together, and in the sheer weight of material the system could bring to bear. Both approaches made good soldiers. Only one of them could drive a siege gun up a city street and knock a defended block flat, while the infantry walked through the holes, because only one of them had built the habits and possessed the ammunition to fight that way. Which returns us, at the last, to the German rifleman at his upper window, and to the thing his defense got wrong, which was not really a mistake at all. His concealment did not fail, his position did not fail, his courage did not fail, and neither did his training, which he executed correctly to the end. What failed was the assumption underneath all of it, the assumption he shared with every soldier in the garrison and with the doctrine that had schooled them, that the enemy would come down the street. It was a reasonable assumption. It had been true in every city battle those men had studied. It was true for the first few days at Aachen, in every case where the Americans were forced into the open, and then it stopped being true, because the Americans had learned to make it false, and the entire defense rested on it. So the walls tell the story better than any casualty figure can. The German soldier hid behind the walls because the walls were strength. They were cover from the street, thickness against the shells, and the frame of the fortress. The American soldier came through those same walls because to him they were not a fortress at all. They were simply the next thing to blow a hole in, a road that happened to be made of brick, a way to reach the enemy without ever giving that enemy the shot in the street he had waited for. The defender and the attacker looked at the same wall and saw two entirely different objects. To one it was a shield, to the other it was a door. That gap, between a shield and a door, was the whole difference between the army that expected to bleed the Americans for weeks and the army that took the first city of the Reich in a matter of days. The men who defended Aachen were not beaten because they were worse soldiers than the men who took it. They were beaten because they answered, with great skill, a question the Americans had quietly stopped asking. They fortified the street. The Americans went through the walls, and a defense that has perfected the street has nothing left to say to an enemy who was never going to be there. If this account gave you something worth thinking about, a like helps it find the people who care about how these battles were really decided. And subscribing means the next deep dive into the parts of the war that rarely make the standard histories will find its way to you.